Hi, good morning, everyone. So I'm really excited to be able to facilitate this part of today's discussion and to talk with you a little bit about the Public Policy Advisory Group that MHP put together this year. And before I turn it over to some of the PPAG members, I wanted to give a brief introduction into what exactly the Public Policy Advisory Group is and some of the work that we did. The Public Policy Advisory Group, or the PPAG, was established to provide MHP with expertise and insight to promote innovative and lasting solutions for affordable and sustainable housing. The PPAG advises MHP on policy development and evaluation, including review of potential structural inequities and impacts on communities of color. So MHP uses a variety of inputs, including work groups and task force of subject matter experts to identify, develop, research, and finalize our policy agenda. The PPAG is an additional input of subject matter experts explicitly chartered with the primary tasks of reviewing, evaluating, and advising on how policy, 1, responds to housing needs traditionally overlooked, 2, imposes unintended consequences on impacted communities, 3, addresses structural inequities in the housing ecosystem, 4, improves outcomes for communities of color, and 5, enhances existing market products and tools and maximizes private, local, and federal resources. Much of the PPAG's charter is the result of over a year's worth of internal equity strategic planning within MHP, and the PPAG was really envisioned to put formal processes in place to ensure that our policy development process reflected these goals. The PPAG was developed in part to expand MHP's policy development process and expand our network of influencers. 15 members were recruited last fall from a wide variety of housing industries, and you can see the membership on the slide before you. Members brought decades worth of experience in their fields, including a range of experience with public policy development. In an effort to expand our influencers, a lot of effort was put into recruiting individuals with a variety of connections to MHP. So some had over a decade's worth of interaction with MHP, while others were very new to MHP's work. And this resulted in, and I think, in an exciting cohort of individuals who came together. So our work as a group began in January as we engaged in a cohort learning environment and professional development. We worked over the course of 5 months through a series of meetings, which became virtual through May. In addition, MHP staff conducted one-on-one outreach with members, and we also had a number of additional ways for members to provide input and feedback through other engagement processes. And this all resulted in the end of May with a finalized criteria, which D'Angelos will talk about in a little bit. And this criteria is intended to provide a guide of policy evaluation focused on housing finance. And I will say too, as our work shifted due to COVID-19, it really expanded, and it presented a really unique opportunity for the PPAG to advise MHP on a series of recommendations to policymakers that were shared with Senator Jeff Hayden in the Senate, as well as Commissioner Ho and the governor and lieutenant governor and other policymakers. The work of this cohort is intended to live on through the next iteration in our second cohort. In addition, the criteria that this cohort developed will provide MHP with a framework to evaluate all policy as we set our next policy agenda. And that process really begins now in the summer at the end of the legislative session and thinking through the next biennium. A public report of this final product will be finalized by MHP staff and shared and made available. But I'm going to turn it over now to D'Angelos Svengensen to provide more insight into the final criteria and highlight some of the recommendations that the group was able to make. So D'Angelos.
Good morning, everyone. Hopefully your coffee is starting to kick in and that the energy in the brain is firing. As you mentioned, D'Angelos Svengensen, founder and CEO of NAO Partners, a urban planning and real estate consulting firm for public and private sector leaders. And I would just preface that the work of the Public Policy Advisory Group kicked off in January. And so as we talk about some of the findings and criteria, We were saying things that we knew needed to happen. But in hindsight, now with the murder of George Floyd and COVID, it's almost like we were in prophecy about what was the priority for our region. And so the four criteria that were really established, number one was race equity. We need to consider how race equity shows up in the outcomes that our programs deliver, but also in the inputs in which we deliver those outcomes, meaning more opportunities for diverse developers, contractors, and more opportunities for diverse homeowners on the other end of the funnel. Most of the members in the PPAG said that this was the top priority and that our region, as well as the state, needs to focus on race equity as the lens in which we review and hold each other accountable. The second is that we need to develop a system for measuring the greatest impact from our limited funding. Is it beds? Are we simply trying to create beds and we're going to create a production house for beds? Or are we looking to obtain other measures of success and outcomes that balance the volume of units with, or the volume of homeowners with the quality of units and the quality of community that's being created? And so I think there's a real, there's a meaty tension here about maximizing output versus maximizing periods of affordability, maximizing other holistic outcomes within the ecosystem. Number three, the predictable and dependable funding really had to deal with how are we, the question is, how do we get more diverse participants in the affordable housing ecosystem? And there's a need for capacity building, but the capacity building can't be a pilot program. If I'm going to ramp up my business to support this ecosystem, I need to understand what the consistency is behind the funding models so that I can really hire for that and prepare our organization to really tackle that and become experts. Otherwise, you're asking me to use existing staff for a pilot, and it's really not feasible in the long term. The last, enhance wealth and ownership opportunities. I believe many of you saw the article that recently came out in the Star Trib, as well as other leaders in town have been talking about it for many years. Home ownership and wealth creation through single family housing is really a challenge for our region. We haven't done it successfully. We have, almost half for people of color, especially African Americans, in home ownership as the majority white population here in town. And so we need to think about how do we do this differently. And I think there's a lot of work happening around 2 and 4 unit as the first home and primary home. A lot of work from a lot of the partners about how do we be innovative and not just focus on the traditional single family home. How do we focus on other avenues of ownership and wealth creation, but then also wrestle with the tension that creates between ownership as well as creating 2 and 4 unit rental incomes, and how do we balance our affordability and other metrics throughout the region. There were a couple other priorities that, because COVID happened midstream for everyone, there were 3 things that we felt like needed to be addressed in moving forward. A lot of it was reinforcing that this region has a tough time supporting Black, Indigenous, and people of color as homeowners and aspiring homeowners. COVID is not going to make that easier, especially with a lot of jobs for those people in those communities really being hemorrhaged by the COVID-19 impacts. And so how can we make sure no greater harm happens? And then also, how can we support the diverse professional service firms that service this ecosystem? When work dries up, we saw a lot of capital partners only focus on existing clients, with majority in the 90 percentile of their existing clients being non-diverse. That means that the opportunities for diverse professionals to really emerge during this crisis was hemorrhaged as well. And so we also have to promote housing stability. I know there was some conversation earlier about rent subsidies, and also how do we balance the needs of a vast number of people across the state, and focusing on how can we preserve public land, for public housing and affordable homes, and how can we really double down on the NOAA housing and probably provide higher levels of affordability if we focus on some subsidy in that area versus in the new construction. So there's a lot of, sacred cows in which the PPAG really focused on conversing about, because our region as a status quo simply is not cutting it. So I'll turn it back over to Libby to kind of dive deeper into the discussion, but that's a really high level synopsis of where we came from collectively as a group.
Thank you, D'Angelos. And so hopefully that gives you a little teaser of what's to come in the report that it will be made available to all of you. And I hope that you all take a look at it. This was a lot of work and a lot of intention put behind these criteria and this series of recommendations that were sent off to policymakers. So I'm just going to ask our panel participants to introduce themselves. Sarah Berkey, Program Officer at Family Housing Fund. I will start with you. You could tell us a little bit about yourself and what drew you to participating in the PPAG.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Sarah Berkey from the Family Housing Fund. I'm a program officer focused on efforts and strategies to increase and preserve the supply of housing in our region. I really appreciated being part of this experiment, this new pilot effort for a public policy advisory group at MHP, getting more voices into the policy process, and not just in advocacy, but in analyzing and evaluating and informing how policy is developed is a really good opportunity. And I really appreciated working with everyone else in the group, getting the chance to work through all sorts of interesting questions with them.
And then Shua Lee, the Vice President of Community Development at Wells Fargo.
I suppose turning myself off mute would be good. Good morning, everyone. I'm Shua Lee with Community Development at Wells Fargo. And, when I first was offered this opportunity to participate in this public policy advisory group, I was hesitant because I hadn't worked in policy work before. But after talking with Libby, I realized that my community development work and my focus on low and moderate income communities through my work would offer a good perspective to bring to the group. And so it was exciting to be able to participate, learn more about policy work and policy making, and then also meet new people and learn from them as well.
Sure. And then D'Angelos, if you could tell us a little bit more about what drew you to participating.
Yeah, I think, for me, it was around how do I challenge the gut assumptions that I have? I mean, if you work as a practitioner in this ecosystem, sometimes you can feel alone, like you're the only one who gets it and no one else sees the bigger picture because you're so in the weeds with other partners. And I think this was a chance to kind of step back, get with other housing practitioners and policy experts, and see really what I'm seeing similar to what everyone else is seeing. And I think through this process, we kind of identify that, yes, there's actually a lot of practitioners who have the same pain points when helping clients, when helping project partners, when helping diverse professionals. And so this was a real chance to kind of do the hard work of like, all right, how can we create an overarching framework that will help address the majority of the challenges that we're all experiencing.
So I'm going to start off with some questions about more the process and participation before getting into more details about the criteria and recommendations. Shua, can you speak to your experience directly engaging with policymakers? This is something that we've talked about offline. What did you find unique and interesting about these experiences, and how did this help inform you as you think about policy work in the future?
Well, I appreciated the opportunity to talk with Senator Hayden and also the staff from Minnesota Housing, and listening to the decades-long experience and history from the former Minnesota Housing Commissioner, Mary Tingerthal. Obviously, there was folks who are very well versed and had a lot of great experience with policy work. So it was great to hear from them. And also hear about the things that they're working toward in the future. I think the interesting piece for me was, you know, I think coming into this, being as green as I was, I thought it was going to be so much more complicated to try to explain the perspective that we see from the work that we do in community. And it really wasn't as difficult. It was really just seeing what we feel is important from all the data that we've gathered, what we hear from community members, from nonprofit leaders, and then bringing that to the fore. I mean, it's simply as easy as that. And I took it to be much more complicated. So that was kind of refreshing to realize that you don't have to come with, you know, memorize stats just coming out of your mouth, that you really can just speak from experience. So that was great, and that's something that I will absolutely use in any, you know, sort of future work that I do.
Thanks. Sarah, in your introduction, you did mention that you were drawn to the PPAG because it would provide an opportunity to work with others with diverse experiences and perspective. Can you just expand a little about why this is so important in public policy development?
Sure. You know, and I met all sorts of new people and also got to work with people I already knew, but in a really new way through this group. So I appreciated that. You know, when you discuss policy evaluation, you start with framing the problem you're trying to solve. And framing the problems was very interesting with this group because we had people working in all different corners of the housing world, you know, public and private and nonprofit. We had lenders, developers, kind of researchers, and folks who really focused more on home ownership and more on rental, as well as at different stages of careers. So we were able to kind of hear from some people, how did we get here? You know, what is your experience that you can tell us more about, you know, the history of policy development that led us to this place? And we also had some people coming from a new perspective or from an outside perspective saying, why are we here and why isn't this working better? I really appreciated that.
Great, thanks. D'Angelos, what is important about setting criteria when evaluating policy options and policy results?
I think from kind of the cohort experience, there was a lot of appreciation for the regional thought leadership and kind of statewide thought leadership that has taken place. A lot of good work by partners, but I do feel like there was a sense of there wasn't a consistent and transparent accountability or measurable across the ecosystem. And so the ambiguity really leaves a lot of wiggle room for ineffectiveness. And so we felt like, you know, in order for us to really be objective about what's possible, but then also dream a little, we needed some kind of framework or criteria to really set the roadmap. And, you know, this all happened, you know, kind of prior to race being thrusted back into the American conversation with the murder of George Floyd. So it was already in the ecosystem. People were already thinking about it as one of the outcomes. It's just, it hasn't been named in a way that we hold ourselves accountable to our outcomes as well as our inputs about how we're doing and addressing it in the ecosystem.
Great. Well, I'm glad you used the word accountability because that's something that I didn't say in my introduction, but this really is a work product that is intended to help keep MHP accountable to the work that the PPAG did, but also again to the goals of the PPAG and how we are evaluating policy for its impacts on different communities. So I think that's important to highlight. So moving more toward the criteria and some of the recommendations from the group, Sarah, one concept that the PPAG really grappled with on numerous occasions was the issue of trade-offs. And we heard from policymakers, from the former commissioner, as well as current staff members at Minnesota Housing about, you know, how they make decisions when there are trade-offs. Can you tell us a little bit about how the PPAG worked through these conversations related to its criteria around achieving the greatest impact from limited public dollars?
Sure. So, and I think D'Angelo started to speak to this a little in his introduction. You know, we all agree that with our limited public dollars, it's really important to make impact. But defining impact is the challenge, and the challenge is in the details. So is it better to support many more homeowners at moderate incomes, or to really focus on supporting a lower income group, but with smaller numbers of homeowners that you can serve? And is it better to focus on really creating rental housing when the market opportunity is there to create rental housing? Or is it important to really say, but are we creating wealth? Are we creating ownership opportunities? And those goals don't necessarily line up very well. I think one really interesting trade-off in housing policy now is, affordability for creating units in the short term versus investing in longer term affordability, a smaller number of homes, but affordable for 99 years or in perpetuity. And it's all about how much information we get to understand those trade-offs. I think we were just getting started on that conversation, honestly, in our first 5 months, and the world kept changing around us as D'Angelo spoke to, with the pandemic, with a new focus on something we already knew we were dealing with, which is racial inequity. And so I look forward to seeing what the next cohort can do to build on that work and to really delve into those trade-offs.
Yeah, and to that point, in our trade-off conversations, we often focused on trade-offs within a particular criteria. D'Angelo, when evaluating a specific criteria, how would you weigh the different criteria against one another if there were tensions between them?
So this is, it's challenging, one, but two, it's very nuanced. So I won't bog down, and I'll leave some excitement for the report. But I think there's a serious need for us to consider how we view our housing ecosystem and how we map out our ecosystem. And particularly our partners, because we don't have a collective understanding yet of the output versus input, and which partner is on which side of the equation, and some partners are on both sides, and that can also add another layer of challenges. But for instance, the race equity criteria may have a strong tension internally in regards to how do you encourage diverse, smaller developers who may want to invest and develop in their communities. There's a real tension behind how much funding do we continue to put into communities of color with affordable and the kind of macro conversation versus, how many dollars end up in specific zip codes for all the kind of other reasons, I will say, where dollars end up. And are those dollars ending up there? Are there units? Because some of the program dollars are different than the kind of actual construction capital dollars. And so taking a look at that entire lens in the ecosystem and really diving into, this is where the ROI conversation comes in about what are we really asking ourselves to do as a region and as a state, because they may be very inherently different than the missions in which these organizations have been founded. And so we have to do some work in identifying who is doing what a little bit better, and probably lean out our ecosystem. But I think the criteria becomes much more manageable for difficult and tension-filled policy discussions once there's a more transparent prioritization that takes place. And I don't think we have done that work of making our priorities as transparent from the minutia level that really dives into application and rubric scoring. But I'll cover more of that later.
Well, D'Angelo, my next question is for you again. And Shu, I'm curious to know, because you have some experience on LISC's advisory committee on this issue. Some of the PPAG's final recommendations to Commissioner Ho and the administration focus on prioritizing opportunities for Black, Indigenous, people of color, developers and contractors. What are specific recommendations that you would highlight within those recommendations for the Investors Council this morning, kind of as top priorities, and how do members of this group support the goals identified by the PPAG?
You want Shua to go first or me?
You could start, Edla.
All right, great. Kind of building off of kind of the thesis that I think the PPAG was working from is that we need to empower our elected officials and also policymakers and kind of head of departments with some real intentionality, an intentionality that I think our region hasn't seen. A lot of the race equity things are natural occurrences? No, I think some of them are actually intentional occurrences in the disparities that we have and we continue to see, as particularly if any one of you looked at the recent study that came out of Boston with the amount of discrimination in rental housing for everyone. And so we need to be that intentional in doing the right thing and overcorrecting in the marketplace. And I think that shows up, you know, when we talked about supporting developers of color or diverse homeowners or Black and Indigenous. I think there's 3 tangible things that we can be hyper intentional. And that one of them is really around the scoring rubric for project RFP awards, and also on the local level, but then also on the super RFP and QAP funding applications, by showing that we care if someone is partnering with diverse partners to get the project done. I mean, we have to be intentional about creating an inclusive economics, but then also this regional economy needs that as the populations continue to shift. And so we need to show that we care in our scoring and our awarding, not as a bonus, but as a core component of these applications. And that also goes into where is the impact being delivered. And we know this is important because the status quo that we've seen even the past 10 years, we've made small incremental changes to a very macro big problem. And so I think we need to think much, much bigger. And this moment calls for us to think much, much bigger. I'll be very quick with the next 2. Number 2 is being strategic and deliberate and ensuring the housing ecosystem continues to receive high quality data from its housing program partners regarding participation and the numbers, but then also holding our program partners accountable, commensurate with the amount of funding they receive for the outcomes that we say we want to deliver in the ecosystem. It's not good just to serve a lot of people, but you need to serve a lot of people and actually deliver the outcomes that our ecosystem is saying that we want to have done. And we have to reward those who are doing better jobs than others. And lastly, we cannot reinforce a race to the bottom pricing methodology, especially when we talk about professional services in the housing and capital improvement arena. Right now, we're forcing a lot of services to be packed into a very, very small fixed fee structure, especially in the professional service side, which doesn't allow for the depth of need that the populations that we're serving actually require. I mean, I spent a lot of time over the last 4 months learning about the project that was done, Great River Landing, and how the architectural team, the ownership team, the program partners really spent over and above what was allowed in their funding that was restricted at the state level to really make sure they built a project of high quality for the people. They spent time with the people before they were housed, designed to their nuance. They were programmed to the nuance of that population. We don't reward that kind of behavior. We penalize it and we force you to be a production house versus a service provider for the populations that we are serving. So I think there needs to be a re-examination of how we reward good behavior in the ecosystem. And I don't think we haven't delivered that hard conversation yet. And I think it's time for us to do that. Shua?
All that I would add to that is I hear from business owners quite often, and it's always, you know, there's no supports there for them, no roadmaps. It's as if the ecosystem wants them to fail. And so the only thing that I would ask is when we put together programs and we, you know, whether it's government agencies or nonprofits, and we're trying to help these BIPOC developers of color, that we make it less cumbersome and make it easier for them to figure out how they can participate and how they can be successful. Whether that's, you know, adding some sort of a mentoring component or something else. I know I talked a little bit with Elizabeth about this, that when I first asked about mentoring in some of the meetings earlier, that I would get the response, well, no one's going to pay for that. I'm like, well, we need to structure that into the program so that it is paid for. Like, I don't understand why that would just be eliminated because it's not set up that way. We can set it up that way. so that, you know, these developers who are newer to the game can get the experience that they need to really stand on their own. So that's all that I would add. Thank you.
Thanks, Shua. So we need to wrap up this part of the conversation. I'm going to do that with one final question that all of you can answer quickly. And that is really, you know, COVID-19 really made an impact on the work that we were doing. We started this at a very, I would say, high level, almost theoretical level, looking at policy evaluation. And we started by analyzing the affordable housing tax credit to use as kind of our base or our grounding for criteria development. COVID-19 happened and so much shifted in all of our worlds. And it definitely impacted the work that we did. Can all of you just share a little bit about how COVID-19 impacted what you thought was important or what you were interested in analyzing through this process? And again, I just asked, I'll start with Shua and then go to Sarah and then D'Angelo's to, and ask for, you know, a quick response from each of you.
I like many of the panelists said earlier, COVID really just brought everything that we already knew were issues to the forefront. And so I'm really glad that we walked away from this whole process understanding that race equity is a major issue and that we have to really tackle it and that it has to be a priority. It can't be an afterthought. So I just, we see from all the data and from all the articles and from, you know, anecdotal stories that, you know, this pandemic has really impacted communities of color more than any other communities. And so it's something that we just have to keep, you know, tackling and not let it fall to the wayside as we often do. So that's all that I would add.
You know, Libby, I would say that, you know, in addition to everything Shua just said, I agree. I really appreciate that the pandemic and the visibility of the racial equity crisis made us get from the theoretical realm down to the ground level a lot more quickly than we might have already done with this group. I think the risk in that is that we're also facing sort of a retrenchment or a sense that we don't have many resources available. We have to really defend what we already had rather than ask for more. And I think that is really unfortunate because we see the need is bigger than ever and we have a lot of good ideas and we have a lot of ways to inform better policy and to know that it's worthwhile to invest more. And yet it's even harder to ask for it now. So thinking ahead and thinking big and maintaining that larger picture, even as we're in this constrained resource environment, is really critical now.
Thanks, Sarah. And I don't know, D'Angelo, do you have something to add very quickly?
Yeah, I would say that, you know, COVID impacted roughly 45%. I'm just going to use African American community because that's where I got the most recent data. So 45% were affected so adversely that they may not come back, and 25% are saying that they're just not coming back at all. So that creates a bunch of housing fragility in our ecosystem that we just need to understand that everything is interconnected. When we look at over 700 businesses were damaged in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and some of the rioting and looting, we're talking about housing infrastructure weakness that we see created. And so as we talk about how we rebuild our ecosystem, how we rebuild our region, we really need to think much, much bigger than we normally have and take the constraints off, because I think our policymakers are understanding that right now is a time for us to double down in new ways, if you will, and create new pathways for rebuilding our ecosystem.
Thank you, everyone. So again, thank you so much to D'Angelo's, to Sarah, and to Shua, and to all of the PPAG members.